Hi guys! Today we're going to talk about Chapter 3 in your textbook, which is about the first cities and civilizations. So I'm going to be talking a lot. I have to split this lecture into two. It's not important that you write down everything that I say or everything that you hear. Get down 3 or 4 of the most important topics, things that stand out to you, or things that I specifically say write down, and then enjoy the rest of the lecture. Following the Neolithic Revolution, cities started to emerge, and in these cities we saw a common culture, a common language, a common religion, and the populations grew, and as the populations grew, we get the first civilizations. Now, the first civilizations all settled down close to river valleys, which is why we call them the river valley civilizations. And these first civilizations developed around 3,500 to 3,000 BCE. The first of these is Mesopotamia, the breadbasket of civilization, the cradle of Middle Eastern civilizations. Mesopotamia emerged as a place of competing city-states in Sumer. Now, the environment in Mesopotamia really influenced the way that the entire society would emerge, and that's primarily because the Tigris and the Euphrates River were highly unpredictable in terms of their flooding, and their flooding often created very violent results. Regardless, agriculture could be cultivated, which led to that surplus in food, which then led to that specialization in labor, which led to these competitive city-states. It also led to the world's earliest known form of writing, known as cuneiform. And the cuneiform itself is very straight-lined with wedges and ridges, not very decorative, not very ornate. Mesopotamia also has class hierarchy. Now, Uruk, the largest city in Mesopotamia at this time, had around 50,000 people by the 3rd millennium BCE, and we can best see class hierarchy in their megalithic monumental architecture known as the ziggurat. The ziggurat was a stepped temple structure, and anytime we see a large piece of architecture, we have to know that there was some kind of class hierarchy, because they're not going to let the architect move those heavy bricks. They're not going to allow the priests to set the mortar. Those were dangerous jobs. So you need to have a large population of people whose lives you didn't necessarily care about in order to create these enormous palaces. And these temples could only be entered by specific priests, and they were created for the very finicky, human-like gods of the Mesopotamian pantheon. Now, compared to Egypt, Mesopotamia looks pretty brutish. Egypt was founded in the Nile River Valley in the northeastern part of Africa. And right off the bat, Egypt is different from Mesopotamia in that it is a unified state. There's no competition city-states. As a matter of fact, cities in Egypt are far less prominent than they were in Sumer. Again, we get this surplus of wheat and barley, just like in Mesopotamia. That surplus led to specialization and class hierarchy and writing. Now, the writing in Egypt is significantly different than that in Mesopotamia because they actually had 2 different forms of writing. The one that we know most about is the hieroglyphics. In the hieroglyphics, we can even see class hierarchy in the hieroglyphics. At the very top of the class hierarchy in Egypt, you had the pharaoh, and Pharaoh was believed to be the god on earth, this divine ruler. And this all goes back to the Nile River, its predictability, the fact that it was a very mellow and mild river that people believed would then influence their religious style. Now, farther south of Egypt was the kingdom of Nubia. Now, there was cultural diffusion between the ancient Egyptians and Nubia, especially because they could reach each other by land route, and sometimes they were able to reach each other through river routes, but the Nile River was very difficult to have to transport on because of the amount of cataracts or small waterfalls that existed. Egypt and Nubia, even in their art, we can see that there was a cultural diffusion and there was a sharing between people. There was also borrowing that would retain their unique elements, and that's because Nubia and Egypt were constantly fighting each other. Next, we're going to bounce over to the Western Hemisphere, over to Norte Chico in South America. Norte Chico was about 25 urban centers that were created along the western coast of Peru, and they flourished between 3000 and 1800 BCE. There was little rainfall in this area, but there were dozens of rivers, and as a result of the small amount of rainfall, agriculture wasn't that prominent. Instead, their economy was based on fishing because of those rivers, because of that western coast. And they didn't really rely on the grain-based farming such as they did in Mesoamerica, which we'll see in a minute. Because they didn't need any way to collect their grain, to collect seeds, or to collect the finished product, they also didn't create pottery. They didn't create a writing system either, but, and this is something I do want you to write down, there is the existence of the 5,000-year-old record-keeping system called the Quipu. That's Quipu, and it's a knotted rope that was used to keep records. We'll look more into that when we get to the classic era of the Inca. Next, we're going to go right back over to the Eastern Hemisphere, into Pakistan and India, to the Harappan civilization. This civilization, for the most part, revolves around the Indus River Valley, which is a river that exists in Pakistan. And by 2000 BCE, the Harappan civilization and culture was much larger than Mesopotamia, Egypt, or coastal Peru. They had elaborately planned cities with grid-like street patterns, with sewage and trash chutes that would take the waste outside of the city. They would have these wells and bathing houses. They also had standardized weights and even standardized bricks that they could use as a form of currency, which is vastly different from any of the other ancient civilizations, because those civilizations used something called bartering, but the Indus River Valley civilizations used an actual currency. They had irrigated agriculture. They also created a written language, which thus far is still undeciphered. Now, besides the fact that there was jewelry, that there was bronze statuettes, that there was this architecture in the city plans, there's no evidence of a king or warrior class, and there's little evidence of a political hierarchy. The Harappan city structure and the Harappan culture is very different from the other civilizations in that way. Next, we go over to China. And China's civilization occurred perhaps as early as 2200 BCE. The first civilization was this idealized state called the Xia dynasty. That's Xia, the Xia dynasty. And there's really only small amounts of archaeological evidence from architecture. Really, we like to date Chinese society and civilization, starting with the Shang dynasty, S-H-A-N-G. And the Shang dynasty was very centralized, similar to the government and politics of the Nile River Valley. The Shang dynasty created something called the Mandate of Heaven, in which there was a contract between the ruler, known as the Son of Heaven, and the gods. The gods would allow the Son of Heaven, the Emperor, and his family to rule as long as he was an upstanding and worthy human being. And the only way that we know about this isn't from writing kept on clay tablets like they had in Mesopotamia, or writing that they kept along walls like they did in the Nile River. Instead, all of our written evidence comes from the Shang dynasty, is something called the oracle bones. The oracle bones were created by priests, and what they did was they wrote this Chinese language. It was a sort of proto-Chinese language into turtle shells, into the tibia and fibia of animal bones. They would be questions that they would have for the gods. They would throw those bones then into a fire. The bones would crack because of the heat. And then the priests would read along the lines, and these questions would be, will the emperor have a son? Will the warring in the Qing dynasty die down this year? Will there be a drought? What will the agriculture be? And these are the kinds of records that inform us of how complex and centralized the Shang dynasty was. Next, we're going to go to Teotihuacan, which is located in the Central Valley of Mexico. Now, Teotihuacan is very different from Norte Chico in that they did rely on agriculture and that maize, that corn-based agriculture. There were perhaps around 200,000 people compared to, in Mesopotamia, the largest city of 50,000 people. Teotihuacan was enormous. There were dozens of temples that lined up with the different astronomical events that occurred at that time. They also created pyramids. Now, Teotihuacan is also a little bit different from the other places because of the large amounts of human sacrifice that occurred. The Shang dynasty was known for doing human sacrifice, but not on the level as Teotihuacan did. Now, the reason that Teotihuacan did these sacrifices is that they believed that their entire society and that their livelihood depended on feeding and satiating the gods. And the only way that the gods could be satiated was through bloodletting and blood sacrifices. You could start as small as just small cuts on the body or sacrificing animals, up to full-blown human life sacrifices. Now, Teotihuacan gods were similar to Mesopotamian gods in that they also acted in a human-like way and required sacrifice. We're going to go to part 2 of cities, inequalities, and new social realities, where we look at more of the big picture of these civilizations, how they compare to each other, and how they contrast. Thanks, guys.